Alright, welcome back guys. So in this video, we're now going to move on to chapter 10. And in chapter 10, basically I just call it Memory Mechanics Part 2. So now we're going to talk about, pretty much your whole thing is going to be about the first thing we're going to talk about. And that has to do with passive and active memory states, right? So we didn't really talk too much about it last chapter, but your subconscious memory, right? So your subconscious memory, which we talked about that all of last chapter, it has a kind of parity component to it, which we didn't mention. So we talked about how subconscious memory, there are two different kinds, right? So there's positive memory and there's negative memory, right? Positive memory, subconscious memory is always associated with some subject or some point of focus. And when you focus on that subject, right, you access a subconscious memory. So you access the stored association in the memory, or you could say you access something that causes your subconscious to switch to a state that compels you to have the same thoughts and feelings you had the last time you were focused on that subject. And that compulsion could be described by properties related to what we've been calling negative memory, or properties related to what we call positive memory, right? Negative memory causes the compulsion to basically just compel you in a way that reflects the nature of a ground state or a normal state of awareness. Has a property that it makes it harder. The more negative a subconscious memory is, the harder it is for you to enter a transcendental state while you're focused on that subject. The more positive the memory is, which means it's more charged up, the easier it is for you to enter a transcendental state and use transcendental mental abilities and express them more intensely while you're focused on that subject, right? So, but what we didn't talk about is another phenomenon, which just to go over that, I'll read this first point. So what effect does subconscious memory have when your attention is not focused on this subject? So that's something we didn't address at all in the previous chapter. And what I mean by that is, what is the subconscious memory doing when you're not focused on the subject, right? So, like I said, when you focus on the subject associated with subconscious memory, then yes, it switches to, when you focus on the subject associated with the subconscious memory, you access the association stored within the subconscious memory that causes your subconscious to switch to a particular state and it starts compelling you. But that's when you focus on the subject, right? What happens when you're not focused on the subject? What is it doing? What effect does it have in your subconscious? Does it have any effect? Does it just kind of disappear and just kind of go into the ether and not really do anything? Or does it still have an impact on your subconscious when nothing is going on? And just as an example, so an example I gave in the previous chapter is, let's say you like a girl and you have a crush on her. So whenever she walks in the room, you feel all these emotions rushing in, right? What that means is that your subconscious is charged, right? So it has a charge relative. Now, this other thing we said is that its subconscious charge is always relative to some point of focus, right? We'll go into more detail on that later. There is a bit more to say on that, which actually has to do with passive and active memory states. But for now, we'll just say a charge is relative to some point of focus. So if I focus on this girl, right, I access all these feelings. So that represents, it means I'm accessing the subconscious memory that's reflecting that charge or carrying the charge. We talk more about carrying the charge in chapter 11. But when I don't focus on her, right, what happens with that subconscious memory? Now I don't feel all those feelings. I don't have all those emotions. So I'm not expressing that romantic emotion of love. I'm not producing transcendental imagination or some fantasy about her, right? Those are all transcendental mental abilities. When I focus on some other random thing, right, my subconscious ability to express all those transcendental mental abilities goes away. Like, let's say I focus on something that's a lot of negative memory, right? And my subconscious in this ground state, that goes away. So I'm no longer accessing that charge. However, right, what is the memory itself doing, right? Because it still has an energy component, right? Excuse me, my camera actually died. So, like I was saying, where I think I was talking about what happens when you stop focusing on something that carries a lot of charge, right? So, let's say that I focus on something that has a lot of negative memory, right? So my subconscious switches from a charged state or a state where it's expressing where I'm able to express transcendental mental abilities, or is performing subconscious actions at a transcendental, in a way that reflects the transcendental mental abilities. And then when I focus on something that has negative memory, the subconscious switches to its ground state, and then I'm using normal mental abilities, right? But what is that memory that did carry the charge? What is it doing, right? When I'm not focused on its associated subject? Well, to understand that, I like to give the example in the book. I think I give the example of being robbed in an alley, right? So let's say I'm in a dark alley, right? I start flashing a whole bunch of money for everyone to see, and some scrupulous figure, some unscrupulous figure, I think is the right way to say it, they stick a knife at me or pull a gun on me or whatever and ask me to give them my money. Now let's say I get all scared and I give them the money, right? Now when I go home, right, and I'm thinking about that event, right, I'll feel anxiety, right? Because in that situation, I produced an intention which said this situation was threatening. It had a threat assessment level that went beyond the danger frequency. So I think my subconscious switched to a frequency that my body recognized and responded to by charging the anxiety frequency. So I feel the anxiety emotion very quickly, so it charges very fast because it's coming from the body. Now let's say the event is over and I'm walking home and I keep thinking about what happened. What's going to happen? I'm going to keep feeling more anxiety. In other words, if you think of the event itself as the subject, so that carries the charge, right? That has the positive memory such that when I focus on the memory or the subject that represents the dark alley, thinking about the dark alley and getting robbed and things like that, we'll talk more about how that works, because that might sound like it's multiple subjects. We talk a little more about that in chapter 13, but for now you can just think of it as one subject. When I think about the dark alley, a subconscious switches to a, well, I was going to say something about this, but we haven't gone over that yet. So my subconscious, when I focus on the dark alley, my subconscious switches to a particular configuration that represented the state it was in when the robbery was happening, and it charges the anxiety, or it's charged up at the anxiety frequency, compels me to feel anxiety, alters my perception to think in the way anxiety causes people to think. And so when the experience just happened, those feelings are still very strong, right? And you don't even have to really interpret that in terms of subconscious energy mechanics. Just think about it, when if you have a traumatic event, right, a few minutes after the traumatic event, and you think about what happened, you're going to still have all those feelings very powerfully and very strongly. So let's say that I go home, right, and then I keep thinking about it and I keep feeling all this anxiety. But then I relax a little, I put on my favorite TV show, and my attention's on the TV show. What's going to happen to that feeling of anxiety? I'm going to feel a little bit less of it, right? I'm not going to feel it as much when I'm watching my TV show and I'm immersed in what's happening. But here's what's interesting. Will it completely go away if I do that, right? And I've had this super traumatic event, right? I'm feeling all of this intense anxiety, right? But I turn on the TV to kind of take my mind off of it, right? And it does help, right, when I'm watching TV. But is it completely gone? And for a moment, I can't feel any anxiety whatsoever, not even a tiny bit, right? Well, if you had those kinds of experiences, you would probably say, based on your memory, that doesn't really feel like that's what happens, right? Even when I'm watching the TV, I still feel a little tiny bit of anxiety, just not as much. So I feel a little bit better, but I'm not completely, feeling wonderful just because I watched the TV right after a traumatic experience. However, let's say you now watch the TV a year later, right? Do you still feel the emotions from that traumatic experience? Generally, no, right? You don't feel it at all. It's a completely distant memory, right? And you can feel wonderful now watching your TV show. So what does that tell us, right? Actually, I think I kind of went over everything here, but let me just read it anyway. If I get robbed in a dark alley, my anxiety will be most fresh in the first few moments after the robbery occurs. However, I will feel a little bit better when taking my attention off the memory of the experience, perhaps by watching TV. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. So, yeah, when you, a year later, you're going to completely feel better and the memory is gone. So, I mean, the feelings, traumatic feelings are pretty much gone. So what does that tell us about the nature of the subconscious memory that had all that charge or had a lot of positive memory related to the frequency of anxiety, right? Because remember, each positive memories have an energy component, which also means they have a frequency component, right? They also have a subconscious action component. So what can we say about that subconscious memory, presuming that our framework is correct, right? So presuming that the charge is specifically associated with or carried by the positive memory that's associated or connected to the dark alley, right? And if I watch a TV show right after the experience, right, and my attention, now remember what we said about attention, you can't think something that, or no, let me put it another way. You access the subconscious memory based on your attention focusing on the subject associated with the memory. So if my attention is on the TV show, let's say all of my attention, because remember, attention has a quantity to it. It's almost like a vector, right? It has a magnitude and a sense of direction. But let's say my attention, all of my attention is on the TV show, so it's completely off the subject associated with the dark alley, right? Yet I'm still feeling a little bit of the traumatic emotion, according to what we said. So what does that tell us about that memory, subconscious memory? Well, what it says is that the subconscious memory does still have the ability, if it has a lot of positive memory, it does actually still have the ability to influence or impact how you feel or the way your subconscious compels you. Now, what's interesting about that is that notice even when my attention was off the memory or off the subject associated with the memory, which was the dark alley, at some point as I'm watching a TV show, virtually all of my attention won't be on the memory. Then how is it still affecting me if, according to what we said, memory, the subconscious memory has to be accessed when you focused on the subject associated with it? But it's still impacting me when my attention isn't focused. All right, so my camera actually cut off on me again, so I had to set things back up. So where I think I left off was we were talking about the dark alley and how the subconscious memory is able to impact you, even when your attention isn't necessarily on the dark alley. So remember, like we said, attention is it's almost like a vector quantity, so it has a direction and magnitude, right? But the magnitude could be divided or concentrated. Now, let's say even when majority of your attention is on the TV, right, or the TV show you're watching, at some point, you could say that it wasn't on the subject associated with the subconscious memory, right? So how is it still able to influence you if, according to what we're saying, you have to focus on the subject associated with the subconscious memory to access that memory? Well, what this example shows us is that a subconscious memory actually can still influence you. It does still influence your subconscious mind, even when you're not focused on the subject associated with that memory, right? But what we can see is that, in going back to the example, what we can see is that when we are focused on the subject associated with the memory, so if I focus on the dark alley, right after having a traumatic experience with it, I feel all those feelings of anxiety, right? They come in much more strongly. However, right, let's say a few minutes after this traumatic experience, right, I'm at home, I'm watching TV to try to make myself feel better. I will eventually feel a little bit better, even though I still feel some of that anxiety and some of those negative feelings. So that tells us that when we're not focused on the subject associated with a subconscious memory, its impact on our subconscious is weaker, right? And when we are focused on that the subject of the subconscious memory, the impact of that subconscious memory on our subconscious is stronger, right? And so that's very important. And so that brings us to this third point, which now we're going to actually see a new kind of parity, which we didn't talk about in the previous chapter. So we're going to come up with new terms to talk about when we're talking about the subconscious memory that you're focus on the subject for, and when you're talking about a subconscious memory that you're not focused on the subject for. So subconscious memory enters an active state when you focus on the associated subject, which I call active memory, and enters a passive state when you stop focusing on the subject associated with that subconscious memory, which I call a passive memory, right? So it's very important. So the type of parity, which is still kind of a parity, but we talked about last chapter about a parity with subconscious memory in general. So the whole thing, right? There are two kinds, right? So it has negative memory and it has positive memory. Well, now this kind of parity is another kind of parity within each subconscious memory, whether it's positive or negative. They both experience this kind of parity. So it's active. So in every subconscious memory has the potential to enter an active state, and when it does, we would call it active memory, or it can enter a passive state, in which case we would call it passive memory, right? And it has the property that active memory always impacts the subconscious mind much more powerfully than passive memory. Or you could put it another way and say that active memory impacts your conscious mind. Because when the subconscious memory goes into an active state, right, the association stored within a memory is accessed, and your subconscious reverts to some particular state based on how you behaved before when focused on that subject, and it compels you very strongly. So it always compels you more powerfully when that subconscious memory is in an active state versus a passive state. So now we could get into the weeds and start talking about attention, because this idea does kind of come from what we said about the attention principle. So remember what I said, the more attention you put on a particular subject or thought or intention, right? A particular subject, the more powerful your subconscious response is to the intention associated with that subject. So this is just really an extension of that, right? When your attention isn't on the subject, right, there's less attention on it, therefore the subconscious memory has a less strong response. Ostensibly, if the experience just happened, presumably you could say a tiny bit of your attention is always on it, so that's why it has a weaker response. But I don't think it's necessary to, get that specific about it in terms of the how much attention you're putting on the subject. We'll just kind of make things easy and just say it's either an active state or it isn't. We're not going to really, I don't feel the need to get into the specificity of how much attention you're putting on it and how passive the memory is or how active, you know what I mean? But we'll just say it's either an active state or a passive state, depending on if you're focused on the subject or not. So now going into the example, I think we gave an example earlier about the girl, right? So let's say there's a girl that I have a crush on, right? So when she walks in the room, right, like my mind goes crazy, right, because I have a crush on her. What ends up happening as soon as I focus on her, right, there's associated subconscious memory associated with her, right, in my subconscious mind. When I focus on her, that subconscious memory is accessed, right, and now it switches to an active state. So it becomes active memory. And when it switches to an active state, right, the charge or the positive memory stored in that subconscious memory, well, that's a funny way of putting it, but you could say the subconscious memory is a positive subconscious memory, or has a lot of positive memory. I think you get what I'm trying to say. So it has a lot of positive memory, which means it has a lot of charge, right? So when I focus on her, I access the memory and I access the charge, right? And then it starts compelling me to feel a lot of emotions. So I feel the emotion of love very intensely, and I have transcendental imagination and belief and things like that. And so, however, now when she walks away and I go back to my work, things like that, I don't feel those feelings. I might still feel them a little bit, but I don't feel them as intensely, right? But if I felt them really intensely, right, they don't go away instantly, right? And so this is also an important thing about subconscious memory, right? Positive memory specifically, which I forgot to mention. So remember what we said about energy, subconscious energy. So when you charge energy, right, it doesn't just, you can't instantly charge it right away and instantly discharge and get rid of it immediately, right? It lingers around. It takes time to disappear and build up. So, even when I stop focusing on the girl, right, that charged energy is still in my subconscious memory, right? Still there. It's just I don't feel it as much when it goes into a passive state, but I can still feel it a little bit. And so when she goes away, right, I still have that feeling of love. If it was really intense, right, I still have that feeling of love, but I just don't feel it as much. So in other words, the subconscious memory associated with the girl goes to a passive state, right, and it doesn't compel me as strongly. So it's easier for me to focus on what I got to do this and do that, but I will still feel it a little bit. In fact, passive memory is where what we call your mood comes from. So in other words, I'll be kind of in a lovey-dovey mood even when I'm not necessarily focused on it. We'll talk more about mood in the next chapter, but mood, what we call your mood, is actually an effect of passive memory. But, so when she leaves, I don't feel it as much. It's easier for me to focus. And then when I see her again, all those feelings come rushing back, and I feel, I feel lovey-dovey again, right? Because her subconscious memory switched back to an active state. So that's very important, right? Every subconscious memory can enter an active state or a passive state. Passive memory always has a much less intense effect on the subconscious and the conscious mind than active memory, right? This is true even when it relates to creativity, right, or performance. We'll talk more about in chapter 13. A lot of times, transcendental belief, control, or creativity really just is useful when you're talking about performance overall. So in transcendental performance, right, this same principle can happen, right? So you've probably had experiences in your life where, like, let's say you were in some type of circumstance. Let's say you're in a circumstance where you have to go on stage and give a speech or debate someone about a certain topic. You might have been maybe a little bit nervous when it first happened, or if you had to learn how to talk to girls, like you might not have known how to do it at first. But then once you practiced it and got used to it, as soon as you get thrown in that situation, you know exactly what to do now. What does that actually represent? That actually represents this, right? You charged a whole bunch of subconscious memory, and it became very positive, so it represented the subconscious charge related to some activity, right? For now, we can just think of the activity as the subject. Like I think I said it before, we'll talk more about how subjects works in terms of whole activities in chapter 13. But for now, you can just think of the activity as subject. So when you get in that subject, when you get in that activity, your subconscious switches to an active state, or the subconscious memory associated with that, your performance related to that activity switches to an active state, and now you can perform transcendentally, right? However, when you move away from that situation, it switches to a passive state. And you might kind of be in, that happens basically when you're in the zone, right? And when you leave that situation, you don't feel that compulsions to perform in a certain way as much, right? Let's say you're a great debater, right? As soon as you get thrown into a debate, you know exactly what to do. Let's say you're a debater on politics, right? And you've charged your subconscious to debate certain topics. So as soon as someone even tries to debate you, you immediately jump into like debate mode and you know what to do. That's actually your subconscious memory associated with transcendental performance switching to an active state. So it starts compelling you very strongly. Now, when you leave a debate and you're just talking to regular people, you're not feeling those compulsions as strongly, but some part of you might still feel a little bit of that debate mode, and you're just itching to get back to a debate. That's because the charged memory switched to a passive state. So it's affecting your mood, right, and making you feel like a debate, but you don't feel it as much. So it happens with every transcendental mental ability, this parity of active state and active subconscious memory state and passive subconscious memory state. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is actually this topic, because we didn't actually talk too much about it last chapter, how subconscious memory discharges. So how subconscious energy discharges in terms of subconscious memory. Because we actually said that the more positive a subconscious memory becomes, that's actually the same as what we've been saying when we've been saying your subconscious charges, right? So whenever your subconscious charges up, what it really means is some subconscious memory is becoming more and more and more positive, right? But we never really talked about what discharging means in terms of subconscious memory. And the reason is because we have to talk about it more in terms of passive and active memory. So in this case, right, we have to kind of be a little bit more clear about what discharging means. These are just definitions, right? So for me, the way I look at it is this is what I've come up with in terms of what it means for subconscious energy to discharge. So just to read this off and then I'll explain it. So subconscious memory discharges while in a passive state and either becomes more positive while in an active state or more negative while in an active state, but it cannot discharge in an active state. So that's important because this is how I think about discharging, right? And some people may disagree with this, but the way I look at it is that subconscious energy, it actually doesn't ever discharge when it's in an active state. So if I'm focused on some subject, right, my subconscious can't really discharge while I'm focused on it. When I focus on it, there are two possibilities that are going to happen, right? One, if I focus on some subject, let's say it has a lot of charge, right? Let's say it's a song, right, that has a lot of charge, and I feel a lot of emotion and stimulation and imagination while I'm focused on it, while I'm listening to the song and I'm focused on the song, right? Well, as I keep focusing on the song and keep listening to it, what's going to happen? Well, one possibility is subconscious entropy, right? So your subconscious favors a ground state, which in another way of putting that is to say that it favors the condition that the more experiences you have with some particular subject, the harder and harder a time it has entering a transcendental state and staying within its ground state. So, in other words, if I keep listening to a song more and more and more, it's going to be harder and harder and harder for me to feel more emotion, use transcendental imagination, and then my subconscious, eventually it'll just be, it's very easy for me to stay in a normal state of awareness while listening to a song. I barely feel anything. So it's gotten old to me. Or, the other possibility that's going to happen when I focus on that song is going to be kind of what we're going to talk about in chapter 11, so next chapter, is that my subconscious is going to charge and it's going to get more and more positive. Now to do that, you kind of have to have an idea of how subconscious energy charges. It doesn't happen, I would say it doesn't, I was going to say it doesn't happen naturally. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but you mentally, you have to go out of your way to use techniques to do that. Otherwise, subconscious entropy will be favored and you'll just lose lose your subconscious charge, or you won't be able to enter a transcendental state as easily, right? The effect of positive memory will be reduced, and so those are two possibilities. But I don't think of those as discharging per se, right? It's so if subconscious entropy happens, negative memory just builds up so much that it suppresses positive memory. And then I stop entering a transcendental state, and then eventually negative memory just takes over. So why do I say it discharges in passive memory? Well, in passive memory, what actually happens, so if you stop focusing on some subject, then the energy component of the positive memory actually just goes away over time. So it gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker until it's basically just gone, right? So in that sense, it discharges. So what that means is that subconscious energy discharges when you're not focused on the subject that carries the charge, right? So that's very important. So for example, if let's say I have a crush on the girl, right? And if I just keep focusing on her, then one of two things are going to happen. Either subconscious entropy is going to happen and I just stop feeling much of anything for her, or I feel more and more and more love for her, right? One of those two possibilities will happen, but the energy is not necessarily going to discharge. But let's say that my subconscious memory associated with her is charged up, right? But I stop, and it's compelling me to think about her, but I stop thinking about her, right? Because you can always resist the compulsion, right? Let's say I stop thinking about her, and I stop thinking about her more, and each day after day, I just go without just choosing not to think about her, even though I might feel compelled to, right? There might be an urge to think about her, but I'm like, I'm not going to, I'm too busy, right? What's going to actually happen is that compulsion is going to start becoming less strong and less strong and less strong until I don't feel it at all. And then when I focus on her, so the subconscious memory switches to an active state, I might feel a little something, but it's not nearly going to be as strong as before. Why? Because all the energy is discharged. So when it's in an active state, I might feel a tiny bit of it, but I definitely don't feel any of it when it's in a passive state, because like we said, passive memory is always a less strong effect than active memory. So that's basically how the subconscious discharges, right? By the way, I think I mentioned it before already, but just to say it again, just in case, if your when you feel a compulsion to think, when subconscious memory compels you to think about a certain subject, right? Subconscious entropy is useful. Again, subconscious entropy is useful because it it prevents that feedback loop that's going to cause you to just charge energy forever, right? Because if I focused on, let's say, a song that I really like, and I was feeling this compulsion to think about it, if I choose to focus on a song because I feel compelled, let's say the subconscious memory kept becoming more positive. And even though I can resist the compulsion to think about it, it's going to be hard to because of the intensity of the charge. So if I think about it more, then my subconscious memory just become more positive, right? And then it's an endless feedback loop, and it gets harder and harder to resist the urge to focus on a song. And eventually, I'll just kind of go crazy and get lost in focusing on a song endlessly, right? So subconscious entropy sort of breaks that cycle and prevents that from happening. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I forgot. No, I think that's pretty much it. So in next video, we're going to talk a little more about your subconscious mood and how it affects subconscious activity. I might combine the next 2, maybe 3 sections, and we're going to talk, because passive memory actually plays a very important role in subconscious charging, which we're going to see. The most intense subconscious charge is actually related to passive memory. So you have to know what's going on with passive memory in your subconscious mind in order to charge to the most intense levels, which we'll talk about. That affects emotion and that affects transcendental performance, right? So performing at a transcendental level in pretty much any activity, whether it be conversations, singing, dancing, whatever, right? You have to know what's going on with passive memory. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.